Hi, my name is Amakana and I help property investors become property developers even if they've got no prior experience. Now, I'm sorry, I'm coming live from my office and I'm using a really sophisticated filing system, as you can see in the background. But anyway, I recently did a survey in my Facebook group and I asked people what was the most difficult thing about property development, or what did they find the most difficult about property development. And most of the people actually answered that doing numbers was the most difficult thing. When we start out, financial feasibility is the most difficult thing to do. The reason is that we are not aware of all these different costs or the entire process to start off with. But today I've got something really important that I want to share with you, which is the most important thing when it comes to financial feasibility. What you got to remember is that all costs in all projects remain constant. Now, what do I mean by that? Let's say you're building a townhouse. So whether you're building it in the suburbs or you're building it in the city, the cost of that is actually going to remain the same. Of all the costs in property development, there are actually going to be just two costs that are going to be variable: your land value and market value. And I'll get into an example and show you exactly what I mean. But before we do that, make sure you go to feasibility.info. That's feasibility.info. Okay, so here's the example. Let's say this is our a financial feasibility of a unit. So it doesn't matter whether this is only for example purposes. It doesn't matter whether it's for a townhouse or whether it's for an apartment. So let's say these are all the different costs. These are different cost heads that you're going to incur different costs in. But to simplify things and to explain and tell you what I'm talking about, let's say you've got a GRV of 500,000 and the land value is 120,000. Construction is 260 for a single townhouse, for example. Consultants for that particular townhouse is going to be about $5,000. Council contribution, usually it is a percentage of the land value, but depending upon which council area you're dealing with, they have different formulas of calculating council contribution. So this is another thing that is dependent upon what you actually end up paying for the land. GST, that's $10,000. Marketing and agents commission, let's say $12,500 on a $500,000 dollar townhouse. Miscellaneous plus legal allowance, you've allowed another $5,000 per townhouse for your feasibility. And finance costs are about $15,000 in interest or whatever costs are including in finance costs for that townhouse. So based on this, you've got a development margin of, let's say, 15.7% and a profit of 67,700. Now, what's going to happen if instead of paying 120,000 for the land, you actually end up paying 130,000? Everything else has remained constant. The two things that got affected was the council contribution fees or whatever, because it is dependent upon what you actually end up paying for the land or what your land is valued for. And but everything else, if you see, remained the same. Now, if you pay 130,000 for the same block of land, which you should have paid 120,000 for, that doesn't actually mean that you're going to get an extra uplift in your GRV, which is your $500,000 value of the townhouse, because that price is actually set by the market. That's exactly what you're going to get. Doesn't matter where you are, doesn't matter where you're developing. So whatever the market value is for that townhouse, that's what you're going to get, and that's going to remain constant. And the only thing that's going to change is your land value right here. Now, the market value would change based on how the market is going, because that market value is actually set by the demand and supply in that area. Now, what happens if you end up paying 140,000? Your development margin again falls further. And if you keep going like that, and if you keep paying a little bit more for the land, for the same townhouse, for everything where everything else has remained constant, you will see that eventually you will make a loss. Because if you've ended up paying more for the land, let's say you ended up paying 190,000 for the land, it means that and you still can only sell the townhouse for 500,000, you're actually going to end up making a loss. Now, every time you actually start paying or pay more for the land in terms of $10,000 increments or in terms of accumulated increment, that's the kind of loss you're actually going to start making, or that's the fall in your development margin until eventually it starts touching the red line. Now, if you want to find out more about financial feasibility, just go to feasibility.info. But let's say how much more do I have to sell each unit for to maintain the same amount of GRE? But let's say that could happen, where you could ask for a little bit more for the townhouse that you've just developed, because you want to recuperate some of the losses that you've made. So if that in that scenario, so all I've done in this table is kept everything else constant, but now we're going to start changing the value of the land. So let's say over here you paid 130,000 for the land, which basically means that you have to ask for $12,000 more approximately in order to maintain the same amount of development margin. And if you keep going this way and we look at the same table, that's the increment, that's the higher value that you will have to ask for your townhouses. So in this scenario, in this table, you'll see that in order to maintain the same amount of development margin, every time you paid more for the land, you'll be asking for 4.82% more if you pay $24,000 more for the land. If you pay $37,000 more for the land, that means you'll have to ask for an increment of 7.42% on your sale value. So this is the most important concept about property development, and I think everybody must understand this. And this is what happens when the market's actually going really good, and that's what people end up doing. They pick up something thinking that by the time I'm actually going to come up on the market, I'll be paying more. I'll be able to get more for that development. But that's not necessarily how it actually works. If you want to find out more about property development, just go to feasibility.info to find out more about property development financial feasibility.